The RTX 2080 was made using the 12nm process and is based on the T104 graphics processor. In its 400A A1 variant, it supports DirectX 12 Ultimate. This ensures that all modern games will run on the 2080. Additionally, the DirectX 12 Ultimate capability guarantees support for hardware ray tracing and variable rate shading. The T104 graphics processor is a large chip with a die area of 545mm squared and 13.6 million transistors. NVIDIA has disabled some shading units on the RTX 2080 to reach the product's target shader count. It features 2,944 shading units, 184 texture mapping units and 64 ROPs. Also included are 368 tensor cores which help improve the speed of machine learning applications. The card also has 46 ray tracing acceleration cores. NVIDIA has paired 8GB of GDDR6 memory with the GeForce RTX 2080. The GPU is operating at a frequency of 1515 MHz, which can be boosted to 1710 MHz, and the memory is running at 1750 MHz. This particular model comes with an aftermarket cooler. It's the Fractal Design Celsius S24. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's talk about our reduced testing program. We are now only using 4 synthetic benchmarks, which are Time Spy, Fire Strike, Port Royal and Superposition. The games we are utilising are Control, CSGO, Doom Eternal, Forza Horizon 5, GTA 5, Rocket League and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. We have cut all these down in order to not only keep the video shorter, but also not to throw loads of stats about as well. Right, with that said, let's move on to the first benchmark. Time Spy Extreme. At 4K resolution we see a frame rate of 31 and a graphics score of 5179. At 1440p we see 78 FPS and a graphics score of 11970, and at 1080p we see an FPS score of 101 with a graphics score of 25491. Moving over to Fire Strike, at 4K we have an FPS of 30 and a graphics score of 6454. At 1440p the FPS is 76 with the graphics score at 17469. And finally at 1080p we see the FPS at 127 with the graphics score at 29255. Going over to Port Royal, we see at 4K the FPS is at 13 and a graphics score of 2738. At 1440p we have 30 FPS and a graphics score of 6516. At 1080p we see an FPS of 49 with the graphics score at 10649. And for the last benchmark we have Superposition. At 4K the FPS is 43 and a graphics score of 5789. 1440p shows us the FPS is 87 with the graphics score of 11584. And lastly the 1080p we saw the FPS at 130 and the graphics score at 17386. So the RTX 2080 has a good showing through the benchmarks with the possible exception of Port Royal, which wasn't too hot. Moving over to some games. Control is up first, starting off with high settings. At 1440p the FPS is 39 with a 1% low of just 9. At 1440p 62 is the FPS and 53 for the 1% low. And at 1080 the FPS is 98 and a 1% low of 68. Moving the settings down to low, at 4K, the FPS is 68, 1% low of 44. It's a better showing over the high settings at 4K. 1440p gives us 114 FPS and 84 for the 1% low. At 1080p the FPS is 177 with 1% low of 90. So a pretty decent show there, for the exception of the 4K at high settings letting side down with the poor 1% low showing. Okay, Forza Horizon 5 now. At ultra settings at 4K, the FPS is 44 and 16 is the 1% low. 1440p is 51 FPS and 18 1% low. At 1080p shows marginal improvement with 53 FPS and 19 for the 1% show low. So not the best showing there. With the low settings at 4K we have 76 FPS and 42 at the 1% low. 1440p gives us 84 FPS and a 1% low of 43. And no change for 1080p giving us 84 FPS and 44 for the 1% low. So not the greatest showing of Forza Horizon with particularly poor 1% lows. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With the highest settings at 4K we have 96 FPS and a 1% low of 29. At 1440p we see 145 FPS and a low of 30. And at 1080p we see 150 FPS and a 1% low of just 30 again. With the low settings now, 4K, we have 146 FPS and a low of 36. At 1440p we have 158 FPS and a low of 33. And lastly for this game at 1080p, the FPS is 159 with a low of 34. So although decent FPS, the 1% lows are really poor in this game. Okay, something a bit easier to run, CSGO. High settings at 4K we see 167 FPS and a low of 121. 1440p gives us 253 FPS and 93 for the 1% low. And at 1080p we have 273 FPS and 115, that's the 1% low. Switching it down to low settings at 4K we see 225 FPS and 131 for the lows. At 1440p we see an FPS of 290 and 107 for the lows. 1080p we have 282 for the FPS, which is lower than the previous one, and a 1% low of 114. So CSGO plays great on this card even with the low setting at 1080p and the issues that brings. Another esports title now in Rocket League, we have high quality settings at 4K. We see a 207 FPS and a 102 1% low. At 1440p we see 284 FPS and a low of 152. And at 1080p we see 353 FPS and 190 for the 1% lows. With performance settings turned on at 4K we see 404 FPS and 196 low. At 1440p we see 477 FPS and 316 as the low, and at 1080p the FPS is a bit less than the last entry with 473 FPS and 278 lows. So another game that runs well except for 1080p again. And we finish off with Doom Eternal. With ultra settings at 4K we see 54 FPS and a low of 40. At 1440p we see 97 FPS and a low of 59. And at 1080p it's 102 FPS and a 1% low of 73. With medium settings at 4K we have 60 FPS and a low of 50. 1440p brings 86 FPS with 59 as the low. And to wrap up, at 1080p we have 109 FPS and a low of 83. So all told, a decent showing by the RTX 2080 in this game, but again a couple of issues do show through. So there we have it, the RTX 2080 showing pretty decent show, as we've said, but again, it's not a 1080p card. This one doesn't perform the best at 1080p. If the cooler that is on here gives you a better performance over an air cooler, who's to say? Anybody out there with an air cooler version of this card might be able to say something about that. I don't know, I don't have it, but it's still showing as a good card even today, even though we know the GPU crisis seems to have come to an end. I would certainly have a 2080 in my rig if I had that choice, or only that choice. So there we go. So you know what to do. Give it a like, subscribe, comment, do all that jazz, see what happens, and I'll see you in the next one.